The storm raged as if the sky itself mirrored Maya Collins' devastation. Rain soaked through her thin jacket, clinging to her skin like a second punishment, while her small duffel bag, hurriedly packed in a frenzy of heartbreak, sat heavy at her side. Just hours earlier, her world had been certain. A fiancé she trusted, a best friend she confided in, and a family that, though demanding, had always assured her she was on the right path. Now, in one brutal evening, all of it shattered. She had walked in on her fiancé tangled in a betrayal so raw and intimate that her breath had frozen in her chest. The betrayal didn't just end an engagement. It tore away her sense of safety, stripping her down to nothing but grief and anger. She stumbled out into the night, clutching only what she could carry, her tears indistinguishable from the cold rain on her face. The weight of her mother's voicemail still echoed in her ears, that sharp, dismissive voice accusing her of failure, of embarrassment, of being the daughter who could never quite do things right. With no love to run back to and no family to lean on, Maya sat hunched on the park bench, her heart pounding with the terrifying realization she was utterly, achingly alone. The phone in her trembling hands blinked with a missed call notification, a digital reminder of the lifeline she no longer had the strength or the will to hold on to. Her thumb hovered over the voicemail from her mother, but she pressed delete before the words could pierce her again. It wasn't just the betrayal of her fiancé or her friend that cut deepest. It was the suffocating certainty that her family would see her pain not as heartbreak, but as failure. Their voices, sharp and unyielding, had always demanded she secure stability, that she marry well, that she fit the image of the daughter they could proudly parade. Tonight proved, yet again, that she could not live up to their impossible expectations. The rain blurred the city lights around her, turning the world into streaks of gray and gold, distorted like her vision of the future. In that moment, silence became both her enemy and her only comfort. The emptiness of the bench, the isolation of the storm, and the hollow thud of her heart reminded her that there was no one left to pick up the pieces. Alone, shivering, and fighting the urge to collapse entirely, Maya wrapped her arms around herself. Yet, deep inside the wreckage of her thoughts, a fragile thread of defiance stirred an unspoken question. If she had nothing left, what could she rebuild for herself? It was then, through the downpour, that he appeared. A man tall, quiet, and seemingly weighed down by his own shadows, slid into view with an umbrella in hand. He didn't approach her with pity, nor with the invasive curiosity strangers often had when sensing someone else's pain. Instead, he simply extended the umbrella toward her, shielding her from the storm without asking for thanks, explanations, or introductions. His presence was steady, his silence deliberate. Their eyes met briefly under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp, and in that fleeting glance, Maya saw no judgment, no pressure, no expectation, just understanding, as if he, too, knew the ache of carrying something unspeakable. Ethan Ward didn't press her with questions or fill the silence with hollow words. He simply sat a respectful distance away, sharing the bench without intruding on her solitude. The gesture was small, but in a night where everything she trusted had crumbled, it felt monumental. It was a reminder that connection could exist without demands, that kindness could arrive quietly, unannounced. Though Maya couldn't yet name it, the presence of this silent stranger planted something within her, a fragile seed of hope, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in the world as she believed. Maya Collins had grown up in a home where every curtain had to be perfectly drawn, every smile rehearsed, and every step measured against her parents' exacting standards. In the Collins household, appearances were sacred and happiness was secondary. Her mother, a woman obsessed with social standing, taught her early that mistakes were not just personal failings, they were embarrassments to the family. Maya learned to smile even when she wanted to cry, to obey even when her spirit begged to rebel. The lessons clung to her well into adulthood. She sought approval from teachers, from peers, from boyfriends, and most of all, from her parents, whose love always felt conditional. Photography was the only place she had ever felt free, capturing moments no one else noticed, shadows falling across old buildings, laughter caught mid-burst, the quiet beauty of imperfection. Yet when Derek, charming and steady, promised her security and a future her parents would approve of, she shelved her dreams for a respectable life. She traded in her camera for dinner parties, traded late-night creative bursts for schedules, and convinced herself she was happy. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed, a quiet ache for the version of herself she had buried. Derek's betrayal, though devastating, was also a brutal revelation. She had not only lost him, she had lost herself long before. If Maya's life had been built around being seen, Ethan Ward's had been defined by disappearing. A carpenter by trade, he worked with quiet precision, shaping wood into tables, chairs, and staircases that would outlast him, even if the people commissioning them never remembered his name. He was a man who lived in silence, and the silence was deliberate. Neighbors in his small, worn-down building called him strange because he rarely spoke, rarely joined community gatherings, rarely invited anyone into his world. What they didn't know, what Ethan never said aloud, was that his life had been split into two parts, before his sister's death and after. She had been young, vibrant, the one who had coaxed him out of his shell as children. Then, one tragic accident a day, replayed endlessly in his mind, had stolen her from the world, leaving him with a guilt that gnawed at his every breath. He blamed himself, not because anyone told him he should, but because in his heart he believed it. Since then, Ethan carried grief like a second skin, invisible to most, suffocating to him. His silence was not emptiness, but a shield, one that kept him safe from questions he could not answer, from connections he did not believe he deserved. Now, in the aftermath of her shattered engagement, Maya found herself in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, the hum of washing machines beneath her serving as the soundtrack to her new life. It was not glamorous peeling wallpaper, leaky pipes, and the faint smell of detergent that clung to her clothes, but it was hers. For the first time, she was on her own terms, even if the independence felt terrifyingly fragile. It was here, amid the mundanity of survival, that Ethan began to reappear, not dramatically, but in passing. At the grocery store, their eyes would meet as they both reached for the same carton of milk. At the laundromat, she noticed him folding his clothes with careful precision. At the bus stop, they would stand in quiet proximity, neither rushing to break the silence. These encounters, small and almost forgettable, began to stitch themselves into the fabric of Maya's new life. There were no grand conversations, no sweeping gestures, just the slow, steady recognition that they shared something unspoken. In their silence, Maya found relief. With Ethan, she wasn't judged, pitied, or pressured. And for Ethan, in Maya's presence, there was no demand for explanations. No prying questions, just the comfort of being seen without being forced to speak. Their connection didn't ignite in words, but in the quiet space between them, a fragile beginning to something neither of them dared name yet. The knock at her apartment door came late, long after the city had quieted to its nighttime hum. Maya froze, heart thudding, before opening it to find Derek standing there rain-soaked, desperate, his once polished appearance disheveled. His eyes, bloodshot from what he claimed were sleepless nights, searched hers with a pleading urgency. "Maya, it was a mistake," he said, voice breaking as though rehearsed 100 times on his way over. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled back, the memory of his betrayal searing hot in her chest. Derek leaned against the doorframe, speaking of their years together, of plans they had made, of the life he insisted they could still salvage. He painted the affair with her best friend as an impulsive error, a lapse in judgment, something forgivable if only she would give him a chance. Maya stood torn, her resolve wobbling beneath the weight of his familiarity, his charisma, and the echo of what she once believed was love. But then her phone buzzed on the counter, a call from her mother. She didn't need to answer to know the script. She was being dramatic, rash, and should swallow her pride to take Derek back. Her mother's words, so often sharp and dismissive, reverberated in her memory like a command. Torn between the expectations drilled into her since childhood and the raw wound of betrayal, Maya felt cornered. This wasn't just Derek at her door. It was her entire upbringing demanding that she fold to protect appearances at the expense of herself. The argument spilled from the doorway to the street outside the building. Derek's tone, once soft and remorseful, shifted when Maya resisted. "You can't just throw away everything we've built," he hissed, frustration sharpening his voice. When she tried to step back inside, his hand shot out, fingers curling tight around her arm. It wasn't a strike, not even what most would call violence, but the grip was firm enough to make her flinch, to remind her how easily control could shift. The street lamp above flickered, casting jagged shadows on Derek's face, and for a brief second, Maya saw not her fiancé but a stranger, someone who believed he was entitled to her forgiveness, her body, her future. Her chest constricted with panic. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but the years of conditioning, of being told to keep quiet, to be polite, weighed heavily on her. Her voice caught in her throat, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might cave, might let him pull her back into the cycle of appearances and obedience. The pressure of her mother's words, her father's disappointment, and Derek's insistence pressed against her like walls closing in. Just as her breath hitched and her resolve began to falter, a quiet but steady presence emerged from the shadows of the sidewalk. Ethan Ward, his frame calm but unyielding, stepped forward into the charged space between them. Ethan didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't meet Derek's aggression with aggression. Instead, his voice was low, firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who wouldn't be moved. "Let her go," he said simply, his gaze steady on Derek's clenched hand. Derek bristled, his pride wounded by the intrusion, but the strength in Ethan's calmness left little room for argument. Reluctantly, Derek released his grip, muttering curses under his breath before storming off into the night, leaving behind the echo of his threats and pleas. Maya's arm tingled where Derek had held her, but what lingered more powerfully was the realization of what had just happened. For the first time in her life, someone had stepped in not to control her, not to pressure her into compliance, but to protect her. Ethan didn't demand gratitude, didn't ask for explanations. He simply stood there, rain dotting his jacket, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to intervene when someone was being hurt. Mia's chest rose and fell with shaky breaths, her eyes locked on his. She had been taught to believe that love always came with conditions, that help always required repayment, that approval was earned at the cost of herself. But in this small, charged moment, Ethan shattered that narrative. The spark wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was raw and undeniable. The spark of safety, of being seen without judgment. For the first time since her world collapsed, Maya felt something shift inside her. A fragile trust forming in the silence between them in the weeks that followed. Maya and Ethan's paths shifted from chance encounters to intentional meetings. What began as quiet nods at the laundromat grew into shared coffees at a corner cafe, walks through the park where autumn leaves crunched underfoot, and late-night conversations that unfolded slowly, like secrets whispered to the dark. Ethan never pushed. He listened, and when silence filled the air, he let it rest without pressure. In his presence, Maya began to breathe differently, more freely, more authentically. She found herself talking about her photography, a passion she had buried under the weight of expectations and Derek's insistence on a stable career. One evening, she shyly showed Ethan an old print she had kept tucked away in her drawer, a candid shot of children chasing pigeons in the square, full of unfiltered joy. Ethan studied it, not with the polite approval she was used to, but with genuine awe, as if he saw her soul in the image. A week later, he surprised her with a handcrafted wooden frame, smooth and simple, designed with the same quiet care he carried in everything he touched. For Maya, it wasn't just a frame, it was a mirror, reflecting the part of herself she thought she had lost. With Ethan, she began to rediscover the woman she had silenced for so long, a woman who dared to create, to dream, to exist without apology. But just as Maya felt herself regaining pieces of her identity, the familiar weight of her family's expectations came crashing down. Her parents, alarmed by gossip and appearances, staged what they called an intervention. They arrived at her apartment unannounced, their voices sharp with disapproval. Her mother's words cut deepest. "You're throwing your life away, Maya. Derek made a mistake, and you're ruining your future over pride." Her father's voice followed, colder still. "And this Ethan, what kind of man is he? A carpenter? Is this what we raised you for? To end up with someone beneath you?" Their accusations felt like shackles, pulling her back into the cage she had only just begun to escape. The guilt was suffocating. For years, she had measured her worth by their approval, by their vision of what her life should be. Standing her ground now felt like betrayal, like tearing away the fragile thread of belonging she still craved. Yet when she looked at Ethan, when she thought of how he saw her not as a failure, not as a pawn for reputation, but as herself, she realized she was finally breathing without permission. The conflict churned inside her. Was she selfish for breaking tradition? Or was she finally, for the first time, choosing her own life? As Maya wrestled with her family's condemnation, Ethan revealed pieces of the grief that had built his walls. One quiet evening, sitting on the steps outside his workshop, he confessed the truth that haunted him. He had been the one driving the car the night his younger sister died. The guilt had hollowed him out, convincing him he didn't deserve happiness, love, or a future built with anyone else. "I don't let people close," he admitted, his voice low, rough, "because I know what it's like to destroy someone's life." For Maya, his confession was both heartbreaking and illuminating. She saw the strength in his vulnerability, the courage in his honesty, even as he tried to push her away. But the fragile bond they were nurturing was tested further when Derek reemerged, his obsession escalating. He began showing up outside her apartment, leaving notes on her door, even appearing at her cafe with a smile that no longer masked his menace. The safety Maya felt with Ethan contrasted sharply with the danger Derek represented, heightening the storm inside her. She wanted to trust Ethan, to believe in the possibility of healing, but the shadows of guilt, his and hers, loomed large. The tension mounted, a woman trying to reclaim her life, a man convinced he didn't deserve one, and an ex-fiancé who refused to let go. The stage was set for a collision neither of them could yet imagine. The air outside Maya's workplace was thick with dusk and tension when Derek appeared, lurking in the shadows like a storm she had hoped would pass. His voice was sharp, accusatory, dripping with wounded pride as he accused her of humiliating him, of destroying the future he insisted still belonged to them both. The street was quiet, the world reduced to the echo of his words and the pounding of Maya's heartbeat. When she tried to walk away, Derek's frustration boiled over. He shoved her against the wall. Not hard enough to injure, but forceful enough to awaken every buried fear she had carried. Before panic could swallow her whole, Ethan emerged, his presence cutting through the chaos with a force that made Derek falter. Ethan's jaw was tight, his fists clenched, the raw instinct to protect surging to the surface. But just as he moved forward, Maya lifted her voice above the confrontation, startling both men with its strength. "Stop," she cried, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. She stepped between them, her gaze locking on Derek, then flicking to Ethan. "I don't need saving anymore." "One, choose myself." The declaration hung in the air, louder than any blow, more powerful than any retaliation. For the first time, Maya's defiance was not a whisper, not an inner battle. It was a roar that shattered the chains of silence and dependence she had lived under for years. The confrontation with Derek lit a fire that carried Maya to her parents' door that same evening. She stood before them, not as the obedient daughter they had molded, but as the woman she had finally chosen to be. Her mother's face was tight with disapproval, her father's eyes cold with judgment as they demanded explanations, as they called her behavior shameful, reckless, even selfish. For the first time, Maya did not shrink beneath their scorn. Her voice cracked, but it was steady as she said, "You raised me to fear shame more than pain. You taught me to smile through betrayal, to hide behind appearances, to endure instead of live. But I won't anymore. I would rather face the world honestly, broken and imperfect, than live chained to your approval." Her words stunned them into silence, a silence more profound than their usual criticism. She no longer needed their acceptance, nor their validation. She had reclaimed her own. Walking away from them was not easy. The ache of leaving behind family ties burned deeply, but it was a necessary wound, one that bled freedom rather than despair. For the first time, she felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the exhilarating terror of standing completely on her own. Later that night, Ethan sat with Maya in the quiet of his workshop, the scent of sawdust and unfinished wood filling the air. The confrontation with Derek and Maya's courage had broken something open inside him. His voice shook as he finally confessed the truth he had carried like an anchor, that he had been driving the car the night his sister died, that he had been reckless, that he had survived when she had not, and that he had never forgiven himself. His words poured out like a dam bursting, raw and unfiltered, his eyes filled with grief he had hidden for years. Maya listened, tears in her eyes, but her response was firm, unwavering. "You can't punish yourself forever, Ethan." She wouldn't want that. "I see you, the real you, and you deserve more than ghosts." Her words sliced through the self-loathing he had built his life upon, not erasing it, but softening it with the possibility of forgiveness. In that moment, they were not saviors to one another, nor perfect partners in some fairy tale romance. They were two broken souls admitting their scars, bearing truths they had long kept hidden. The emotional peak was not about love declared, but about humanity reclaimed, about choosing life, honesty, and the courage to be seen as they truly were. For Maya, the months that followed became a slow but steady reclamation of the life she had always wanted but never allowed herself to pursue. With trembling hands, she submitted her portfolio to a local arts foundation, unsure if anyone would see value in the photographs she had taken during her years of hiding. To her astonishment, she was awarded a grant, her chance to create something meaningful on her own terms. Her first exhibit, entitled "Strangers Who Change Us," was a collection of candid portraits: a woman waiting for the bus, a child chasing bubbles in the park, an old man feeding pigeons on a bench. And among them, the most striking piece and image of Ethan, captured in quiet reflection, unaware of the lens, his sorrow and strength etched across his profile. The night of the exhibit, Maya stood in the gallery surrounded by soft lights and murmurs of admiration, realizing she had built this moment herself. No fiancé, no parents, no voices dictating her worth, only her vision, her courage, her voice restored. The toxic chains of approval had been cut. She no longer answered calls that came with judgment, no longer bent under the weight of appearances. For the first time, she was not surviving for others, but living for herself, and her art became both her declaration and her freedom. For Ethan, healing did not come in a single moment of revelation, but through small, deliberate acts of connection. Encouraged by Amaya's fierce honesty, he took a step he never thought possible, volunteering at a youth center, offering to teach woodworking to teenagers who had no safe place to go after school. At first, his voice faltered, his hands trembling with the weight of being seen, but the raw eagerness of the kids slowly chipped away at his silence. He watched them sand rough edges off planks, carve shapes with concentration, and smile when a finished piece emerged from their effort. In guiding them, Ethan discovered he wasn't defined solely by the accident that haunted him. He could build not just furniture, but trust, mentorship, and something lasting beyond his grief. For years, he had believed his hands could only destroy, but now they were teaching, creating, healing. Bit by bit, he began opening himself to conversations, sharing laughter he thought he had lost, and even allowing himself the fragile beginnings of belonging in a community. His pain did not vanish, but it was transformed, no longer a prison, but a guide that shaped the way he touched the world. Together, Maya and Ethan forged a bond not built on the illusions of fairy tale romance, but on the raw and unpolished truth of survival. Their connection was quiet, steady, unglamorous in the way stories often demand. Yet it was precisely in that imperfection that it became profound. They walked side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, trusting the silence between them as much as the words they shared. Maya found in Ethan someone who never asked her to be smaller to fit his world. And Ethan found in Maya someone who saw him not as the sum of his guilt, but as a man capable of more. Their lives were not magically free of pain or fear. Derek's shadow lingered. Family wounds still stung, but they faced those struggles with resilience they had once believed themselves incapable of. What tied them together was not rescue, not dependency, but recognition, two broken souls who had chosen to heal in each other's company. Their story did not end with a kiss under fireworks or promises of forever. It ended with something stronger, two people walking forward into uncertain futures, no longer defined by their scars, but empowered by the courage it took to reveal them. It was not romance that saved them, but truth, and in that truth, they found something deeper than love, freedom. Months later, the gallery glowed with soft light, the hum of voices weaving into a backdrop of curiosity and wonder. Maya stood at the entrance, her heart racing, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Her first exhibit, her name printed on the program, her photographs lining the walls, was a reality she had once dismissed as an impossible dream. Guests moved from frame to frame, pausing, tilting their heads, whispering to one another with expressions of recognition and awe. Each photograph told a story of strangers' fleeting encounters captured through her lens, fragments of humanity she had once overlooked in her own search for belonging. For the first time in her life, people weren't praising her for fitting into a mold, or chastising her for stepping out of line. They were moved by her vision, by her. Her parents hadn't come. Their absence stung, the silence of it echoing in a way she could not deny. But the emptiness left behind was filled with something richer, strangers who understood her work, who saw themselves in her photographs, who were touched by her ability to capture truth. The applause, the kind words, the quiet tears of viewers, it was validation, yes, but more than that, it was freedom. She had made this life with her own hands, her own eye, her own voice. At the far end of the gallery, framed apart from the rest, hung a single photograph. It drew people in, holding them in its quiet gravity. The image was simple, a man sitting on a park bench in the rain, an umbrella tilted slightly, his face half shadowed, almost anonymous. Yet the composition carried a weight that made the viewers linger. Beneath it, the title card read, "The Stranger Who Made Me Whole." For Maya, that night had been the beginning of everything, not because Ethan had saved her, but because his silent presence had reminded her she was worth saving herself. The photo wasn't about romance or destiny. It was about a moment of human connection that shifted her life's trajectory. The rain that once symbolized despair now symbolized rebirth, a baptism into a new chapter where she finally lived for herself. As she stood before the piece, memories rushed back. The cold bench, the ache in her chest, the umbrella extended without demand, the silence that held her without judgment. That one small act had changed everything, and capturing it in a frame was her way of honoring not just Ethan, but the version of herself who had chosen to rise from the wreckage. Near the back of the gallery, half hidden behind the crowd, Ethan lingered. He hadn't dressed for the occasion. His shirt was plain, his hands rough with sawdust, a stark contrast to the polished setting, but his presence was enough. Their eyes met across the room. He didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't intrude on her moment. Instead, he offered a single quiet nod, pride written in a subtle curve of his lips, and the steady certainty of his gaze. Maya's chest tightened, not with dependence, but with gratitude. She smiled back, not because she had found a savior, but because she had found herself, and because the man who had reminded her of her own strength stood there, witnessing her becoming. The crowd continued to buzz around her, but in that single exchange, everything she needed was said. A voice rose inside her, steady and strong, like narration over the closing frame of her story. Sometimes the people we least expect enter our lives quietly, not to fix us, but to remind us we were never broken beyond repair. As the lights dimmed slightly and the gallery swelled with applause, Maya inhaled deeply, her heart no longer heavy with loss or fear, but wide open to the future, her future, finally her own.